Can you talk about the one plane that you flew that had that you were talking about last night a little bit about the respirator? All of a sudden,
Well, what happened is, life, as I say, is fate, time, and circumstance. And I never thought I'd get to. And we had at that time free flow oxygen systems. And we had three fellows at Mayo had developed. Randy Lovelace was the top guy, and he was a fantastic pilot. And what he did was he went to 40,000 feet with a free flow oxygen system and did well. But the problem was you couldn't, he had his own mask and everything. They had developed some real good stuff. But free flow oxygen, and they could do it, but you couldn't have every pilot doing that. And the problem was at 28,000 feet, you wouldn't saturate your blood enough. Even with 100% oxygen, you had this, the little bag here, you breathe in and out of the bag, and the airlines tell you, well, it doesn't make any difference whether it's full or not. Well, we had damn well had to have it full. But anyhow, it came from there. And the problem was, we got airplanes, we got the B-17, the B-24, and the P-38 came through with the turbochargers on it. And actually, theoretically, they'd go to 35 or 40,000 feet. And of course, we were limited actually 28,000 feet because above that, you had a great danger of hypoxia. And they scared the hell out of us. We just didn't do it. We didn't know why, but we just didn't do it. Well, anyhow, what happened was I had delivered a B-17 over to England, and I had orders to bring a captured Ju-88, which was a German bomber that had been modified to high altitude. This was a long tube type airplanes, and I forget who I forget, but they had nice smooth running engines. They looked as if they were like, I think they were 12-cylinder, but they weren't radial engines, of course, they were V engines. But they were really smooth. And I got in it had been all labeled by the British, in other words, telling us what everything was, so obviously they'd been through it. And I had orders to take it back to Wright Pat. So I flew it and everything. It was a real easy airplane to fly and ran my fuel consumption. And then I got fascinated out of ways. It's boring as hell going across hour after hour. They had a little round box down there. It says demand regulator. And it had a big tube coming up and a face mask on it. And I soon found it was their oxygen system. So I put the mask on. It was a quite good fitting mask and so on, and so on. And you turned it on down there, which I did. And then essentially, demand, figured you breathe on. But the only thing, you had to suck your guts out to release the oxygen to you. And I figured, Jesus, as an engineer, I can do a hell of a lot better than that. And this airplane, one seat, of course, the pilot's seat faced and the other one faced. There was long tube fuselage, but actually two people in it. And I swiped the one out of the back seat, put it in my B4 and took it back to, they never missed it back there at Wright Pat. But anyhow, I took it back and I started to work on it. And I increased the leverage and redesigned it. The only thing that was metric, and we had SAE here, so I had to make some nuts and bolts for it. But I made a real good demand regulator. In other words, you could just effortless, and it didn't chatter or anything. It chattered at first, but then I got it, and I was real proud of it. And we had Colonel Halsey. He was actually my flight surgeon. And earlier, a fellow had ground looped a Stearman in the afternoon wind, and we got it in the sub depot. And we never took it off the diagonal. We repaired it and we kept it there. And I guess there were probably 3 or 4 of us taught Dr. Halsey how to fly the Stearman. He was 60 at the time. He was a World War I guy, and real good doc. He'd been through the School of Aviation Medicine and also New London submarine medicine, so he was tremendous. But anyhow, he didn't want to embarrass me. I was proud of the regulator, and he says, well, you've gone this far, but he said, you got to have pressure, and he said, it's got to push the air into the lung. I didn't know what in the world he was talking about. But anyhow, he finally showed me what he wanted. I had an aneroid. So at 25,000 feet, the aneroid would swell up and it would give you a continuous flow. Easy aneroid. Boy, it was work pushing out. In other words, this was positive pressure breathing. And I don't know what the heck we called it. But anyhow, the chambers out at March Field only go to 25,000 feet. There was so no way to check it. And that was it. We tried to gaff them and pump it down more, but they wouldn't. So anyhow, it came to the point where we wanted to check them out. And I'd made 6 pretty good prototypes. And Mine Safety Appliance made gas masks. And I took those and cut them apart and made masks and so on. So I had those. The rest of them were pretty much made from scratch. So they worked fairly well. Then Dr. Halsey decided, he says, look, we got brand new airplanes that'll go, let's take it up. So we took a B-17. He wanted to ride co-pilot, which he did, and we had very legal co-pilot watching. And we went up. And this first trip we took up, we went to 10,000 feet, we wrote our names. which were fine. Then we went up to 15,000 feet, wrote our names, and back to 10. And we worked up to 30,000 feet that morning, and absolutely legible. Well, we were excited. We were excited because we knew if it was scribbly, it'd be like being drunk, when you went to altitude. But I wanted to go to 35, but Doc Halsey got chicken that morning. But anyhow, we made repeated flights, probably over, I guess, the next 3 or 4 months, when I was in and out. And it all ended up the same. Well, then, what were we going to do with it? And by rights, I should have taken it back to the Air Materiel Command at Wright-Patt. But I remember one case, I brought the P-38 back there with the first boosted ailerons. And I thought it was fantastic. I remember those damn civilian aeronautical engineers saying, you young bastards are strong in here, you don't need this. So, not invented here, I guess, was the syndrome. And I experienced that. And I figured, well, maybe they had it, maybe they didn't. So I decided not to go back there. And I said to Dr. Halsey, I said, well, and Dr. Armstrong ran the School of Aviation and Medicine. He was 42 years old. He'd flown the XC-35, which was the first pressurized with like Amelia Earhart's airplane. They only made one pressure. He had all that experience, and he was a fantastic guy. He was the old man, of course, at 42. And I asked Dr. Halsey, I said, well, you know him. He said, well, I don't know him that well. I wanted an invitation to go down there. And he says, hell, go down there and drop in. And he found out, actually, that the Dr. Armstrong was there. So one morning, I had a P-51 delivery to Newark, from Long Beach to Newark. And normally, we went from Long Beach into KC and fueled, and it took us 6-7 hours usually, probably closer to 7 hours if the wind was blowing, so a little longer. But anyhow, one morning, I picked one of those delivering. The weather was lousy on the northern route. So I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, went down through Randolph Field and landed there. And I had a prototype with me, and I boldly went right into his office. And he looked at it and he says, well, what do you got? And I said, why do you want to come in here? So I told him, and he was kind of a stern fellow. And I showed him what he said, well, show it to me. So I showed him what I had on demand regulator. And he called 2 other fellows in that I didn't know. He said, these are consultants of the Air Force. They didn't mean anything to me. And he had a bottle of oxygen brought in and so on and hooked it up. And while I'm talking to these other 2 fellows, just casually, and he breathed on it and he said, Stranger, well, this is nothing but a demand regulator. Oh, Christ, my heart went down. But he says, a damn good one. I figured, wow. So anyhow, we started from there. And then I tried to explain, which he understood, how the aneroid would swell up and produce a pressure and so on. But, it was kind of far out and away. And then he asked me, he said, well, how did you check this? He said, the chambers only go to 25,000 feet. And I told him that I'd looked at the chambers over there, and he said, you couldn't check it. Hell, you've got to go up and so on. And then I told him how we did it, and he looked at me stern. He says, you're either a damn fool or you know something I don't. And I said, sir, probably a little of both. Well, anyhow, then he said, well, can you leave this? And I said, that's why I brought it down. And I explained what to do and everything else. He says, I don't know how the hell I'm going to do it other than what you did, taking it up in the airplane to try it. And I told him exactly what we had done. So I left it with him. But he was quite insistent. I had to have that P-51 that was a priority delivery because we took him to Newark, and they took him apart and put him on the boats, you see, and sent him over to Europe. But anyhow, he wanted me to take, and he had 2 fellows that were, one was a cardiologist and the next was in pulmonary medicine, probably the top in the world as consultants to the Air Force. They just happened to be there that day. So anyhow, he insisted we go out to dinner together. And Dr. Cournand, who would go later, he was a cardiologist, would win the Nobel Prize for cardiac catheterization in 1951, but this was well before that. But anyhow, he started to talk to me, and he told me his family was Arpège perfume in France. He had lots of accent and so, but he was smart as hell. And he was an engineer before he went into medicine. And he said, I'm a biomedical guy. And he said, it's fun. He says, I can see what you've done here, but he said, you've got to go into biomedical. I said, no, I'm going back, either stay in the military or go with Eastern, which I was all set up at that time to do. So anyhow, he really worked on me. And then finally we had supper together and so on, and then I flew and delivered my airplane. And I don't know, it was months later. Well, I got TDY to go back, and also they brought my flight surgeon down. We went down to the School of Aviation and answered some questions, but they had already really done a lot. And then probably 3 or 4 months later, I got about 80 pounds of textbooks from Columbia University. And it's just God's Engineering in the Body and the physiology books in there. I didn't pay any attention, but one time I took a physiology book out on a trip, and God, I just got hooked on it. It was so exciting. In other words, here's engineering in the body that way beyond anything that we had ever perceived in physics and so on. So I got hooked on that. And then later on, I developed the pressure suit regulator. And in the process, we had a centrifuge. And the centrifuge was set up so that the chair would be that, and it started to spin, and your head would go in. It was counterbalanced like that. And it was prevented from going heads out because it had a spring, well, it had a pin that went in, the spring would hold the pin in. And it was always fixed safe because we never looked at anti-G stuff, had readouts at all. It was all positive Gs. And I was spinning, I had a nitrogen bottle up here in my deal, and I was running 4 Gs, which was 2 Gs. I cut it in half. And I was going along, and that damn pin broke, and that thing went boom. And this was driven, it had a metal ring around it, and had a tire that actually would spin it up and so on. And boy, that all I remember was boom, and all I could see was kind of red, and I don't remember, it was kind of hazy. Well, anyhow, they stopped the damn thing and got me off there. And of course, they figured I probably hit about 7 Gs when my head went out, because the arm and extension, you know, speedo. So anyhow, boy, I tell you, I figured it was all over. And they they sent me up to Walter Reed and started to check me there. And they figured you have what the circle of Willis, which is your blood supply in your brain and so on. They figured, well, you know, I violated that and so on and so on. And then gradually, I could read big bold print, and it wasn't as red and so on. And over time I started to take and do okay. Of course, I was put on the ground. They brought me before a retirement board and said, well, do you want to retire? And I said, no, I don't want to retire. And they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd just like to take and go back to the School of Aviation Medicine and work with them down there. I think they want me down there, check and see, which they did. So anyhow, that was that. So then I got down there at the School of Aviation Medicine, and the guy said, well, gee, you got to have a medical education. But see, the military didn't have any medical schools at that time. The School of Aviation Medicine was all aeronautical stuff and so on. But boy, they had some damn good docs there. But they used to take and give grants to the various medical schools to do different things. So I became part of the grants. That's how they got me into medical school. So if you you were checking out something in medicine, these were all medical, came out of there, they would check it out. I was included in the grant, so I got a certain amount of education on it. And I got to a formal medical 3 years, which worked out very, very well. Otherwise, I would have never had it. But now, you see, I had the background. I already was pretty damn good in physiology and pathology because of Dr. Cornanda, and I really started to I liked it before, and I knew. So I got down there, I was pretty good on that. So they went through, and I got the education I needed. And that, of course, gave me the biomedical and the ability. So it just worked out fine. And then, as I say, after I had that, then I first developed what was called a Mark 7 respirator, which became standard. It would breed for the smallest baby, the largest adult. But if I hadn't had the military background, I could not have done it. And remember, I used the magnets and my anti-G suit regulator and the diaphragm out of my pressure regulator.